Imagine artwork that impacts civic policy by incorporating community voices. Imagine powerful tools in the hands of marginalized people, including veterans, incarcerated citizens, unhoused people, and at risk youth, that help them tell their own stories while learning to collaborate. Communities using cutting edge technologies to renew connections to traditional foodways, culture, language, and lands. This has been the work of Littleglobe for years, and now they've made their Culture Connects Toolkit, focused on digital storytelling, available to the public.
Welcome to Augmented Humanity. Our guests are modern explorers working at the intersection of technology and the humanities. They help us to understand ourselves and the worlds we create in this digital age. They are thinkers, creators, makers, and academics working in diverse fields like linguistics, technology, game and object design, and ethics. I'm your host, Craig Goldsmith.
I'm your host, Ellen Dornan.
On this program, we're joined by Chris Jonas, co-founder and executive director at Littleglobe, as well as Katy Gross, Littleglobe's deputy director and education director. Littleglobe's mission is to create collaborative art, encourage community capacity, and foster life-affirming connections across the boundaries that divide us.
Chris and Katy, thank you both so much for joining us today. I'm a little bit overwhelmed looking at your portfolio. You've done so many things over so many years. Do you want to tell us a little bit about the kind of collaborative art and storytelling projects you all do?
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here today. So, Littleglobe has been doing this work for 20 years now and began in New York City working with people who were dealing with cancer. And it started with Chris Jonas and Molly Sturgis. And they wanted to create, an opportunity for people who don't necessarily see themselves as artists to come together and create something artistic and to see themselves in a different way. They came together to tell their stories and create a performance, and most of them hadn't known that was what they could do, but they pushed themselves and challenged themselves and worked together and created a performance that they did in front of an audience in New York City. And Chris and Molly came to Santa Fe and brought the work here, and it started with a lot of performance-based artwork and musical composition work. It was really just the process of bringing people together, artists and non-artists, over a period of time and allowing it to unfold naturally.
Your commitment to an interdisciplinary approach, what do you feel like that brings rather than just having artists working on something?
Interdisciplinary art gives different points of access to storytelling. We provide a menu to our storytellers, and some of them find that they resonate with spoken word over and above the moving image. Others find that actually audio is a very powerful way of doing it. Others find that movement on stage is a really great entry point. And it triggers different kinds of stories depending on the disciplines you use and the affinities of the person you're working with. But it also then provides a whole bunch of different kinds of outputs. And so you can collect stories through a multidisciplinary perspective, but then you can share them through a whole polyphony of different ways, which if it's a performance or even a film, it gives so many different kinds of expressions. It keeps it fresh, it keeps it interesting. And so we can express different parts of ourselves. We can hear and experience different parts of ourselves through different disciplines, but we can also share ourselves in different ways through different disciplines.
Given that you've been doing this, Chris, for 20 years, do you think because there are all of these newer tools that are available to the regular person, whether it's easy audio recording or easy video recording and easier ways to disseminate that, have you seen a shift in the kind of projects and stories that you're seeing?
We have very high quality cameras that shoot great video on our phones. With a little bit of instruction, anybody can make a film that you could put on PBS. At least you could do the shooting part. Now, the audio is another thing, but you can use two phones and you can use the great microphones on the phone as well. That has provided all sorts of facility for helping people to co-author their own stories. During isolation, that's one of the great things, is that because of the fact that people have these amazing story capturing devices in their homes, in their pockets, it gives us great capability to work with them through Zoom or whatever for them to create their own pieces. I have to say, though, one of the interesting things about technology that we all experience is that because it's faster, there's less of that kind of granular relationship time that in some ways can help a story to go deeper. And so Yes, we have incorporated technology into our practices in a way that has meant that a lot more people have a lot more access. We can produce a lot more content very fast, which is great. But I have to say, too, that alongside that, we have kept as one of our core practices these long, totally budget unfriendly activities of multi arts performances because of the depth of storytelling that happens, because of what it is to see a person live on stage. And so having that spectrum of opportunities and options, I think has given us a lot of capabilities, yes, to go deep when we can, but also to create a spectrum of stories when possible.
You touch on a lot of different points about collecting stories and creating stories in your Culture Connects Toolkit, and it's really geared toward people being able to sort of take a DIY approach to the technology that they already have on hand and go out and create these stories from it. What was the inspiration for starting to look at putting this together? Or was there a point where you said, we really need to put this in the hands of people so they can more effectively use the technology we have, or were you already teaching that?
We had already been on this path for a few years now, and I've done a lot of media literacy workshops, and that's kind of where I'm coming at it. We're so used to being consumers of media and these bite-sized media tidbits on social media, and so really flipping it and giving people the opportunity to become the producers as well, and not just the consumers, is an important part of our work and what we try to instill and do it with a lot of youth in classrooms. But this spring, when COVID hit, and we were working in partnership with the Santa Fe Art Institute and with Zevan Rael Galvez, who has been a member of our team with Presente, and Chrissy Orr, artists and practitioners. And part of their project with the Art Institute through an NEA grant was to do a storytelling project around the development of the University of Art and Design campus here in Santa Fe, the Midtown campus. And so before COVID, we were, envisioning all these different ways of doing workshops and inviting people in to have events and things. And we realized we couldn't do that. And so that was probably the main impetus to formalizing it and trying to develop some sort of way that we could still engage people and try to reach people during this time of isolation, and really wanting to help people to access the tools that they already have through their phones and other means. And so as a group, we kind of brainstormed different ideas for creative prompts that went into our toolkit. Things like finding an object in your home and telling a story about it, and looking out your front door and taking a picture or recording the sounds that you hear outside your front door. And then it really became a question of, okay, we can give people these prompts, and then what? How do they get the stories to us was a big question that we grappled with. And we experimented with using an online submission form, which we worked on for a long time to try to get it just right. And it still is a really great piece of software because it allows you to put these widgets in that people can just take a picture directly into the form and submit it, or they can record a video or record audio, and all these things that you think are, oh, this is great, everyone's gonna be wanting to submit their story, and then realizing it's still hard to get people to engage virtually if that's all you have. So the toolkit is really kind of a combination of using digital tools and all these different software and apps, but the magic part is the connecting with people part, and how do we still build relationships and form relationships with people. You can't just give someone a form and say, here, fill this out and submit your story. It's a very vulnerable thing to tell a story and to share a story. And so the relationship aspect is still very important. Trying to marry those two things was the key ingredient.
I just want to sort of circle back for the benefit of the listener. The toolkit is like a how-to guide of how to prime the pump and start telling these kinds of stories. But how would you describe the toolkit itself?
It's a guide for how to do a storytelling project from start to finish. And it's geared towards digital storytelling, but again, can be incorporated into live workshops and working with people. So it's really a how to on using storytelling as a way of building community and taking the art of story sharing and creating stories all the way to the realm of policymaking. We have developed this arc of engagement, which is taking the artistic process from start to finish, the act of creating stories and gathering stories, generating stories, the sharing of stories and amplification of them and dissemination back into the community, and then finally the impact of the story. our work has more and more been about connecting people's experiences and having those stories and those experiences taken into the realm of policymaking so that that becomes a part of the process, so that decisions and policies are made in response to people's experiences.
Could you tell us a little bit about how that part of the storytelling art played out with your Presente project?
The Presente project itself is an outgrowth of Esteban's Culture Connects document. It's the cultural roadmap of Santa Fe. He did an assessment of Santa Fe's cultural landscape, not from the perspective solely of the big institutions of Santa Fe, but of the people of Santa Fe. And so, from that lens, reformulating kind of how we as a town think about culture and people. And from that, one of the recommendations was to look at the existential danger that the affordability crisis in Santa Fe has had on displacing the cultural richness of this place. And so Presente, in a lot of ways, was our response to that. It was a carry through of the Culture Connects recommendations to go deep into the stories of home and belonging and displacement. And what happens if we lose the richness of heritage that we have that's contained in the people here? So we gathered stories about the residential experience of people and their connections to the place, people who are brand new here, as well as people whose families have been here for centuries. And then that became kind of a framework for us to be able to be a part of Santa Fe during COVID, because, how it is that we belong when we're in isolation, how it is that we belong when we're afraid of our own income. So Presente itself became a framework that we applied to different parts of Santa Fe and ultimately to the whole town. And when we started working with the Santa Fe Art Institute, and we became aware of the fact that as we as a town talk about the development of the former SFUAD campus, that we need to be talking about it grounded in the stories of the people who are going to be most directly affected by it. When we talk about development, we oftentimes talk in terms of numbers, the cost of the development, how it's going to be paid for, how many people are going to get jobs, numbers like that, all of which are very important. But one of the things we forget to talk about is the impact it's going to have on how this town feels. And so we took this Presente concept and we applied it directly to the Midtown campus. And then, as Katy is saying, then we created the Culture Connects Toolkit and utilized that as an entry point for people to give stories about home and belonging on Midtown campus during COVID.
It sounds like a bonus there too, though, is now you've got this toolkit that you can apply to all sorts of projects, and not just in Santa Fe, but all over.
Absolutely. One of the models we love is the Story Center model, where they've created all these tools and all these concepts. And the fact that that's all open source, the fact that it's available to us is incredible. A lot of people are always saying, oh, you should monetize this, monetize that. And that's maybe true in some cases. But I feel like, particularly during this time of isolation, it's so important for us as a nonprofit to be providing tools that we've developed over these 20 years for anybody to utilize. We hope that if a teacher is looking for a way to sort of invigorate their students' experiences by going into the stories of their own families, that this toolkit should provide a soup to nuts method by which they can do that.
You are a nonprofit, so I presume you are not volunteers, and people do need to get paid, and website hosting needs to be paid for. Do you have donors? Do you go for grants? How do you keep the doors open?
All the above.
Anything that brings in money.
I mean, the good thing is a lot of our work is pretty applicable and usable by public institutions and the state, city, county schools. We enter into a lot of service contracts. One of the things we do a lot of is we do kind of the subjective evidence of a long-range program. Like there's a program in the Department of Higher Education called Gear Up, which is cultivating college-going cultures within high schools, hoping that that's going to help to affect graduation rates and help students to find a pathway to college. It's a huge federal grant, and one of their deliverables is the data on graduation rates and the effect on students, but it's also the testimonies of the students who've been through the program. It's been great because we've been able to bring our super accessible storytelling methods, which are captured digitally and therefore can be transcribed into reports and all that stuff, but it also becomes compelling film that moves the hearts of people. That you see the students who are in our school systems, and we've helped them to tell their own stories. And that has great utility for those kinds of institutions. So, going to your question, we write grants all the time. We're growing our donor program, but we also do a lot of contracts. And those contracts have really helped to sort of bridge the divides so that we do have the capability of paying our team a living wage. For the storytellers who participate and tell their stories, a big value for us is making sure that we have the money to be able to pay people correctly.
You're listening to Augmented Humanity. We'll be back in just a minute. Welcome back to Augmented Humanity.
Welcome, Chris and Katy. Thank you so much for being here. Katy, one of the things that you've been involved in as the Director of Education for Littleglobe is doing training in media literacy and media arts and production. Can you tell us a little bit more about that aspect of your work?
Well, I came into Littleglobe through Youth Media Project, which was a small nonprofit based in Santa Fe, focusing on audio production and radio production. And that was just a really great experience working with so many different types of educational settings. So, working within classrooms, but also working with other nonprofits and other organizations and summer programs. And so with Littleglobe, we operate under a similar model where, we don't necessarily have our own group of youth, but what we do is partner with other organizations that serve youth or classrooms and teachers. And we go in and augment whatever it is that they are already learning and doing and bring in the lens of media literacy and digital storytelling and filmmaking, media production. So I view it as just kind of the beginning foundation for media production. So, we can do workshops that's just on media literacy, how to better read and understand media. And we've developed a curriculum around looking at it through a balanced wellness approach and looking at it as kind of a health and well-being lens, that we consume media similar to the way that we might consume food or what we put into our bodies and minds. And how does media make us feel? How does it actually impact our well-being? Just trying to build awareness, people's awareness. There's no judgment. It's not about you spend 5 hours playing video games and that's bad. It's not scolding. It's just trying to help people and youth better understand their own habits, their own ways of interacting and engaging with media, and really just looking at how that impacts them and makes them feel. And then, with that awareness, developing those skills of, okay, maybe it's time to put the phone away, or maybe I don't need to be watching YouTube videos until 4 a.m. for whatever reason. Maybe it's because it's sleep deprivation, but maybe it's because it's, making me feel anxious. On the other hand, maybe being part of a video game community actually makes me feel connected. It's just about noticing those ways and then bringing it into the realm of being a producer. So you don't just have to consume it and watch videos over and over again, but can you actually contribute your own stories or your own expressions, whatever they may be, through a video or coming up with a hashtag campaign, whatever it might be. So doing that in classrooms and with other nonprofits is a big part of our work. We got a grant from NewMexicoWomen.org to do a multimedia research project with adolescent girls of color this year. We actually put the Culture Connects Toolkit into use by doing a 7-week virtual workshop with young girls from Tewa Women United and Nambe Pueblo Tewa Roots Society. We led the students through this project using the toolkit of coming up with prompts and different activities related to using their phones, learning composition, learning audio recording, video, through making a poem like the I am from prompt, but putting that to images and sound, and then leading them through editing and animation, which was great. We left it up to them, the issues that they wanted to explore through filmmaking and storytelling. And so they came up with their ideas of films that they wanted to make, and we just helped them along that process.
Do you think starting this sort of teaching arc with a foundation in media literacy helps build that connection that you can put storytelling tools in people's hands, but unless you have that hard human work of connecting and relating and reflecting, you're going to come out with a different product? I think you said, Chris, we can all create so much content so fast, but unless we put that time into it, we're just running it up the flagpole and seeing what works.
The media literacy work is about that kind of awareness and just mindfulness around how we interact with media. And I think that runs the whole gamut of media production. And so all of our media projects and, our documentary filmmaking that we do as a team always needs to begin with that relationship with people and just sitting down with them. And over the years, I've really learned more about the ethics of storytelling. And that's really become so important in realizing how much storytelling is really a gift and not something that we should expect people to just give, or that we take. There's the history of extracting stories, obviously, and we try to be as non-extractive as possible. So we have a motto of relationship before task, and really trying to build those relationships. And of course, it's easier when you can be in person with people, but we've developed ways to do it virtually as well. And, it does help also if you are coming into a classroom or another organization, and they've done a lot of that community building as well. Storytelling is sacred and is a gift that needs to be cultivated and not just expected from people.
Circling all the way back, the media wellness is such an interesting way of thinking about it. It makes me want to have nutrition labels on media.
That's one of the activities we did.
You also touched on something that I'm hoping that one or both of you could tease out, the ethics of storytelling. I mean, I know what extractive storytelling is. To me, that's when you tell the story about someone else and you just tell it however you feel like it and maybe exploit it in some way or misrepresent it for your own purposes, even unintentionally. But what are the ethics of storytelling from your perspective?
I think there's actually even a bigger frame. We're actually somewhat of a subversive organization. If we don't obliterate or at least soften the cultural boundaries, not just cultural boundaries, economic boundaries, the historic boundaries, there are existential challenges if you don't know who your next door neighbor is. And the thing is that we storytellers, we can use shorthand for things very readily. But again, one of our models is to take your time, because if we're taking our time and developing a relationship first, the product of that relationship is going to be something we probably won't expect. And whether we call it art or storytelling or something else, we can define that afterwards. The whole point, I think, in terms of our subversion, is that we believe very much in a world of relationships, and that to be a teacher in a classroom, you have to know the stories of the students in your classroom in order to be able to serve them well. You have to have a heartfelt experience of the people around you. You have to be changed by the stories you hear. And so, our job as filmmakers, media artists, composers, it isn't to make art. We do love making art, and we're good at making art, which means we can have successful products. But it's really the vulnerable moment of standing and being moved by somebody. That's really the whole purpose of the work we do. The stories themselves are not the important thing. It is the utility of the stories to move our hearts, to form bonds of kinship that maybe didn't exist beforehand. That's really our primary agenda, is for us to recognize, oh, I could kind of imagine what it's like to be that person. And by doing so, we're going to be better teachers, we're going to be better filmmakers, we're going to be better human beings, better governors, whatever. And so that's a huge part of the ethics of the storytelling. That is our grounding. And so then the ethics itself means that there has to be a continuity between that value and the operations that we have. And if in the process of working with a group of people and they tell amazing stories, and somebody says, oh, that's perfect for a feature documentary, we have to be very careful not to veer into that extractive practice of saying, let's get those stories, let's capture those stories. All these colonial lenses of going in and getting something and doing something with it. It's the activity of the storytelling itself that's our whole purpose, not the end product. If we don't nail the end product, and if it's not compelling and moving, the whole thing doesn't work. And I imagine for a lot of your listeners, this is probably a very familiar question. It's one thing to work in collaboration with people and for them to tell their own stories. But if you have an interview with somebody and it's an hour and 10 minutes long, and you have to cut it down to a 3-minute snippet, how is that not colonial? How is that not extractive? How is it that you, as the editor, don't actually end up retelling somebody else's story? I don't think there's a good answer for this unless you take the time to collaboratively edit that piece, which has got its own questions.
Got me all nervous.
That's the kind of nervousness that we have. The work that we do, I hope, brings to the surface conversations about the power that we each carry. And to be a filmmaker and be very humble and to listen carefully and then go and take that hard drive and cut somebody's piece into a short piece, that is that hard question. We should be feeling that tension. We should understand the responsibility we're all facing. And that models the kind of responsibility I believe that we all have in this world. The whole purpose is not really media making and storytelling and all that stuff. It's really got a much bigger purpose, which is connecting people as human beings.
Do you feel like you've been successful in that regard?
The tension is always there. We just grapple with it. And over this past year through the Culture Connects Toolkit and because of COVID, not having that ability to film people in person, we developed more of this process of people filming themselves and then sending us the footage, which we're calling co-authored stories, and it's collaborative up to the editing part. And so I would say that is still question mark. There's teaching people to tell their own stories from start to finish, and then there's anything along that spectrum, people who film themselves and send it to us and we create the finished product, all the way to they create all of it themselves, including the editing, or the documentary model where we go in and we film people and we interview them and we take it and we edit it. There's the question of, do you show the people along the process as you're editing it and getting their feedback? It's not an easy answer and probably just changes with each individual person.
And one of our heroes is Grace Lee Boggs, who passed away in her 90s. She was part of the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s. And her assessment was that it started off really well, but it needed a process by which it could constantly be assessing itself. Otherwise, the very power structures that the civil rights movement was looking to obliterate would be replicated in the civil rights movement itself. So she created a notion called Dialectical Humanism, which is the capability of being moved by one another, but also the capability that as we go, we're constantly assessing and evaluating and improving and trying to say, oh, wait a second, did we inadvertently create some structures of violence? And so Katie's right. We as a team, we try to take the time to look at things and talk it through and say, something doesn't feel right. And are we sure we're taking the time correctly for people to really have a sense of their own empowerment through our work? Or are we disempowering them by rushing things?
Have you had any spectacular failures despite everyone's best efforts and intentions? Because I feel like we learn from our failures sometimes more than when it all just goes like clockwork.
Yeah, absolutely. We did a project 2013 with inmates from the Metropolitan Detention Center, the jail in Albuquerque. And we taught them the skills of filmmaking in jail so that as they left incarceration, they could capture the story of their individual moment to moment experience of return to the community with no services, being immediately homeless, having a serious drug addiction, and being dropped off right in the middle of the drug part of Albuquerque. And we had hopes that through these films, we would be able to sort of tell success stories and be able to advocate for a policy change that would be much more suited towards what a person needs to do to be successful. The problem was that the world was so unstable for those people that we lost all of our storytellers. They all went back to jail. The situation in the institution changed, and we went from a program based jail to a discipline based one. So everything changed in that perspective. And so we were not able to complete the project, and we struggled very much in terms of trying to tell a positive story when everything was falling apart around us. That isn't necessarily an ethical quandary that we experienced, except for the fact that we felt like we had made promises to really be able to represent their stories to a bigger, broader world. And because we couldn't finish the films, we couldn't finish the project. We did what we could. We made a lovely website, insideoutside.org, which show the short films, and they're harrowing.
I'll bet.
There's one story there, a character named Clyde, who was a man who was brought up in a very violent world. And he talks very intimately about the experience of being a violent offender and where that comes from. And it's the kind of story that we as a community need to sit with.
You're listening to Augmented Humanity. We'll be back in Welcome back to Augmented Humanity.
I just wanted to start by saying you all have us so fired up about your storytelling approach and about making connections, and it's all there for free in your Culture Connects Toolkit. So I'm hoping we can just dig into the toolkit a little bit. The first part of it is sort of just a real how to of gathering stories using prompts and creative activities. Could you talk a little bit about how to get started with prompts or using good prompts?
Prompts are related to the issues we're trying to explore in a project or in a workshop. So the prompts are designed to be open ended and really allow for creative exploration and personal exploration of a topic. We try to get into that personal realm through a variety of ways.
If I may, could I just read a couple of the prompts from your toolkit so that people sort of have an idea of what we're talking about?
Sure.
Absolutely.
So in your toolkit, this is under the examples of prompts. There are prompts also that I guess these are like media categories. So there's prompts that are sentence starters. There's prompts that are for object stories. There are prompts for photos. And then something that I find really interesting, a prompt for what's called a visual map. So for example, a sentence starter prompt says, begin with one of these prompts and free write for 5 minutes. My home smells, sounds, or feels like blank. The difference between house and home is blank. When I look out my front door, I see, smell, hear blank. Under object stories, there are prompts like tell a story about an object that embodies your sense of home. Here are 3 objects in my home that I love the most: your pet, your favorite socks, a photo of your grandparents, etc. A photo prompt. Choose a photo from your life and write or record yourself talking about it. Ask family members to tell what happened before the photo and what happened during the photo and after the photo. And then under visual maps, draw a map of your home, neighborhood, community, your life. Write a paragraph or record a story of memories you have which are related to that location.
I'm so glad that you read those prompts because those were curated by Katy and grabbing from an array of different projects that we've done over the years. And I would say that one of the things you'll notice about those prompts is we don't say, what do you think about this? It's what does your home feel like? Describe what's outside your front door. We're asking people to go into emotions and feelings first. We all have our life stories. We've all got the big moments where something happened or car broke down and we met a whatever, right? We all have those stories that we've told 45 times. And so our objective is to see if there's a way of telling that story that's about the weather. What did it feel like to be in your car with the flat tire and the empty road and whatever it is? It gives not only the audience points of access because you can feel the storyteller's feelings, but it also gives entirely new rich array of opportunities for the storyteller themselves. Oftentimes we'll bring things out of a story that we haven't even considered in terms of who was in the room with you and what did it feel like. My roommate is Dylan Tenario, one of our young filmmakers, and he's from Santo Domingo Pueblo. And one of the questions he asked is he said, I want to know what it feels like to be a Native person and what it feels like to walk onto the plaza. It's such a different thing than asking somebody to say, what do you think we should have done differently on the plaza? What do you think we should put in the place of the now pulled down obelisk? If you ask a person what they think, oftentimes we are talked down to, we're going to tell the same stories. But if we get into the stuff of daily life, then we can start to be human beings again. And then the stories that emerge from that become so much more personal and moving and complex. And it gives us a lot more points of entry to be able to explore those stories and go deeper and richer with them. So that's the purpose of a prompt. We also have the capability through a prompt of actually creating some point of focus throughout a project from beginning to end. Like for the Presente project, describe a place in Santa Fe where you feel like you belong and why. Describe a place in Santa Fe where you don't feel like you belong and why. That will crystallize all the way from the beginning of the project to the end of the project. And it'll keep the focus in a very wide gathering kind of space. And so whatever it is that associates with the notion of belonging is totally fair game, but it keeps us focused on belonging. In some ways, once again, it's that tension between being comprehensive and getting an unexpected sets of things, while at the same time having some sense of momentum and focus through a project.
Which I think would help the storyteller, especially someone who is new to telling a story about their own life or their own community. Like, where do I start? What do I say?
Yeah, or a storyteller will come in with a preconceived notion of a story that they want to tell, and how they're going to tell it. But having an array of different prompts or different ways in might get them to think about it differently and get into a different aspect of the story. One prompt we like to use that I learned from Chris is looping, and just a writing exercise where you start with, one prompt like, I feel like I belong, then you write for 5 minutes, but then you go back and you circle something in that paragraph, and that becomes the beginning of your next sentence. And so it kind of leads you through a place that you didn't know beforehand where you're going to go with it. So it's just nice to kind of let go of that lizard brain, monkey brain.
So you have additional sections in there that are what you do after you've created these stories as finished products. So say you get this great audio, or you get this great video, or you get these great animations or photo collages, and then what? Would you walk us through a little bit about what the rest of that storytelling arc looks like?
So, having multiple forms of amplification can be really useful. Before this year, when we did Presente in 2019, we had so many different aspects of the project for amplifying the stories that came out of it. And so, kind of our big event was this multimedia performance that took place at the Lenzig, all to create this actual event and experience. The films then were also just shared online and used them as prompts. There were also other aspects. We did a part of the project called Photo Historias, and that was where we asked people to share historical family images that specifically showed history of people and place here in Santa Fe. And we ended up making 4 6-foot banners, enlarging the photos. We also recorded audio interviews with the family members who were either in the photo themselves or it was of their family, talking about the photo and that place and what it means to them. We then put a QR code onto the banner and installed those banners in different areas in town, tried to place them where the photo was taken if we could, and then had the QR code so you could listen to the story while you looked at the photo. So that was another form of amplification. And the social media campaign using the stories as prompts. And that's a big part of our work and kind of goes to the next phase of the project. So, you can have a screening, you can have an event, you can have an installation, you can have a YouTube page. We now have Littleglobe TV as one of our amplification platforms as well. But then the next step is creating another event that uses those films and those stories as prompts, or even using them as another workshop for more stories or more forms of engagement, a city council meeting and sharing the stories there. And again, it kind of comes down to different ways of how you might respond and feel what the stories are about. There is something about having an event. There's an audience of 800 people, and you're sitting down and you're all watching these films together, and you're all experiencing people sharing their stories live, plus music. It's an experience, and that's very different from just being in your home and watching one video at a time. But at the same time, there's one event, and if you miss that event, then that's it. It's over and done with. So yeah, we always try to just have different forms of engagement and ways of amplifying them.
The thing that we found too is that the different kinds of expressions through different disciplines and different platforms give utility to different constituencies. If we're working with young people, if it's going to be shared on social media and can be viewed on a phone, if it's not a 17-minute podcast, but if it's a 2.5-minute compelling, beautifully created film, the storyteller is going to have their own peers view it a lot more. And so giving all sorts of different platforms for different points of access, but also different kinds of engagement practices is really important. The fact that we have had the Lenzig as a partner for years has been fantastic because it's helped us to bring what we do in a very beautiful form to our own local downtown community. Similarly, our long-term relationship with New Mexico PBS, one of our films was carried to tens of millions of American homes. You would think that actually would make a lot of impact on us. Actually, frankly, we get more bang for our buck in terms of impact and in terms of carrying to our own local audience through social media and through Facebook and even venues like the Lensic than we do on a national broadcast. So having all these different kinds of tools gives us such agility to be able to really customize the amplification form of this and its impact on the people we're targeting, that we're intending to have witness this. And I could talk about Littleglobe TV, but I am actually going to boot it back to you, Katy, because Katy is helping to head up a project we're working with the New Mexico Drug Policy Alliance and co-authoring films with people who have experienced problematic drug use and telling their own human stories to make an impact. And again, the amplification of that is going to be essential in terms of helping to affect legislative policy.
That is sort of the third part of the arc that you're describing in the Culture Connects Toolkit is how do you turn this amplification and all these likes for Littleglobe into having an impact on policymaking or getting these stories in front of the people who can really make decisions about how to change things for the better?
Yeah, again, I think of it as a spectrum as well. I mean, there's something to be said about having a 15-year-old girl who goes to Capitol High and took part in a 3-day filmmaking intensive that we had, who was incredibly shy and not wanting to participate, to then deciding she wanted to join our ensemble and perform on stage at the Lensic in front of 800 people. That in and of itself is part of this work, helping her to see herself as someone whose voice matters and who can affect change. After Presente, there were some policymakers and city officials in the audience who saw the performance and were moved by it, and led to actual partnerships with city departments to then incorporate our process into their own projects. So, for instance, our work with the Historic Preservation Department came directly from the Presente project, in that they wanted to know how they could incorporate personal storytelling and testimonial gathering as a part of them wanting to amend their approach to historic preservation. And then, like Chris was saying, the Drug Policy Alliance, we've partnered with Chainbreaker Collective. You know, we as an organization are not an advocacy organization, but we will partner with advocacy organizations and lend our tools and expertise to their work and to help them achieve their goals. So Drug Policy Alliance is working to change policy around the criminalization of drug use here in New Mexico and nationally. So our work is to help tell stories and work with people to share stories about their experience, not with the drug use per se, but really looking at how it's the criminalization of the drug use itself that causes so much chaos and destruction to people's lives. And if we were to treat it as a health issue and not a criminal issue, how would these people's lives be affected? So that project is great. We're in the process of that right now, of creating a series of short films in collaboration with people, having them film themselves and share their own stories, as well as us filming them and interviewing them and shaping these stories together so that the Drug Policy Alliance can take them into the legislative session, put it on their website, and use them for their advocacy work.
Which comes back to what I think Chris was saying in the first segment about being able to tell these stories and make these connections between people and humanizing each other.
Well, yeah, that is part of the tension too, because it's not just about like throwing the ball into the policy court and being like, all right, now make your decision. You've heard this story, now make the best decision and judgment call. But how can we like redesign the whole paradigm if possible?
You're listening to Augmented Humanity. We'll be back in just a minute. Welcome back to Augmented Humanity. Katy and Chris, thank you so much for being with us today. I was going through your toolkit, which is sort of like a kind of a how-to guide for people to be able to start to tell collaborative stories, to tell their own stories using a variety of different media. One of the things that I found really interesting and useful in the document was you have a whole section of parameters and approaches, in particular for group and collaborative storytelling, like fair use of what might be collected media, but also things like ground rules for conducting group collaborations. Could you all talk about those?
The toolkit itself is a collection of learning the hard way, of going through a project and getting at the end of the project and saying, we didn't get permission from the storytellers to use their stuff. Oh no. And then creating insufficient media release forms and sort of over the years learning by doing. And so it's a collection of the 20 years of stuff we've discovered. It's also a set of tools we've acquired from other people. It's a bunch of stuff you're not going to think about until it's too late. It's to be really ready when you're out in the field, working in collaboration with people so you have the right equipment, you've got the right forms, you know what you're going to do with it afterwards, so you can articulate it before, all that stuff.
It also seems like there's a lot in there that helps you get into the frame of mind that these stories are a gift. You're forging a relationship with someone and helping them create a space to tell their own story. And a lot of your talk about ethics and consent and transparency, in my mind, really seems to inform that approach.
Yeah, you have to start with building trust and creating a space where that trust can be built. And that has to be the start of every kind of project like this.
You all have worked with a wide variety of different people, high school students and the elderly. You've talked about incarcerated people and recovering drug users. You've talked about young women of color. And I noticed there's a whole section in your Community Connects toolkit about using a trauma informed approach. Can you tell us a little bit about how Littleglobe works with different communities?
I think part of it is if we don't have the right expertise, knowing that we need to have someone who does have that expertise, depending on that level of trauma that we're stepping into. But we kind of look at it from a broad perspective, too, of historical trauma, creating that space and the environment where people can feel as safe as possible. So then it informs everything, like the prompts that you might use, or thinking about the whole parameters of just what that workshop would look like. And do we need people outside of our areas of expertise there, a social worker or people who have more experience with those issues? And checking in with people throughout the process. So it might be that actual process of them telling their story and making sure people are okay. You might have people telling their story one day, and then it's 3 months later that the story is actually going out into the world or is being shared in some way. So I think having those mechanisms as well to be able to check in with people, because their experience may have changed between when they told their story and when it's being shared. So just keeping that in mind and knowing that people can have the right to want their story taken down, not shared, and having to acknowledge that and respecting that.
If you're talking about stories that are coming from a traumatized person or a traumatized community that person is a member of, you're talking about them feeling safe enough that they can tell their story to begin with.
Well, I think even more profound is that they can choose not to tell their story, or they can choose to tell a different story. It's not our place to convince them to do otherwise. I mean, our teams consist of people who are of and from those communities. Of course, no one person could represent a demographic. But if we're going to be working on the Navajo reservation, ideally the co-facilitators are Navajo, and they have some agility in terms of, the things that I myself wouldn't know. It's not okay to walk into a room and if people are sitting on the floor to not step over their legs. I need a co-facilitator to say, Chris, that's not okay. But also, I think just in terms of sort of being able to hold a space for a hard set of feelings. The safety is not in either avoiding hard material or being able to choose away from hard material or anything like that. It's simply having a space where people feel like the room is able to hold that difficult conversation. There's time to be able to sit with it. It's okay not to talk. There's a whole bunch of arenas of safety, I think, that we have learned and we continue to learn with every different group that we're with. If we have agendas that we can soften them or obliterate them, we can change them. We will oftentimes change with our storytellers as opposed to our funders, which can be a thing. But that's our ethics. That's what we believe in. There is a certain kind of open ended conversation that's a necessity in order to create safety. There isn't like one rule of safety. Every person is going to define it differently. And we have to have the time and the space and the openness to be able to hear that and change course accordingly.
Well, I think that's really appropriate too, given the year that we've just come out of, where people have been traumatized on so many different levels and in so many different arenas. It's almost like people don't even have a way of, like you said, being able to sit with it and express it or not express it, whether it's the racial tension we saw last summer or someone who feels that the election was stolen. They're waking up in a state of shock that is so profound that they actually can't express it and feel like they can't even express it because they're just going to have someone jump down their throat.
I think it's a really useful example because in some settings, yes, I think it's just fine for somebody to say, no, that's not okay. It wasn't stolen, whatever. In our setting, the thing that we encourage in those kinds of moments is for people to be able to speak. There's no need for discussion. It's just people telling their stories. And so you can actually have a circle of very different stories. And if we head into arenas as complicated as politics, like you're speaking of, it's one of the most important things that the facilitator can do is to make sure it's okay for there to be different perspectives and that we don't have to reconcile them. Let people talk from your own feelings. And also, as an organization, we are also learning and changing and trying to figure things out. So it's all of that.
I kind of want to loop around to some of the things that we were talking about earlier with the extractive versus non-extractive storytelling. It's one thing to go to community of marginalized people and say, tell us all your stories. But I think, especially among Native communities, it's happened so much over the last couple hundred years. It's not a privilege to have somebody show up with a TV camera. And so I want to look at what you're talking about with transparency and trust building. I feel like you all have done this so many times with so many different populations of people who have no reason to trust outside storytellers. So what I'm hearing is you go in with somebody from the community, ideally. And then what does that transparency and trust building look like from there?
Well, ideally, instead of us going into a community, it's a community that recognizes that the tools and the structures that we have is something that they want, and they invite us in. To be given an invitation for us to go and to join a community because we have tools and expertise that's going to help them to address some things. For example, we did a big project in Cuba, New Mexico, which had historically been this amazing joining of the Navajo Eastern Agency community and the Hispanic village of Cuba. And over the years, those two worlds had drifted apart. They used to speak each other's languages. And they said, Littleglobe, you guys have something that we could really use. And we would like you to do that. And they invited us in, and we collaborated with the community members themselves as co leaders. So leadership itself was not just us. Of course, we were the ones who had the funding, and therefore there was a certain power dynamic we had to call out. But our objectives were built together. The tools and the methods we built together. The invitations were provided together, and all that. That's kind of the ideal situation. We don't like just going into a community and saying, here, we've got great stuff and you need it. And I think it would be inappropriate for me to go and say, oh, you're a marginalized community. We want to work with you. It's the margins of my world that defines marginalized. For them, I'm the marginalized visitor. And so it's one of the reasons I love being in New Mexico, and has changed me so much, is that there is no cultural consensus here. There's no mainstream culture. Every town is a border town. We're all navigating different cultural and historic differences. And so it's a privilege for us to have tools that we can share with people. And that's what this toolkit is. We change the projects based on what happens. Oftentimes our first steps are wrong and put people off. And we go through the difficult conversations and say, okay, let's rethink this. We were going to make a film, but you guys don't want to make a film. You want to make an after school program. Let's do that.
This is kind of just a super detailed question. Littleglobe was originally formed back east. Is that right, Chris?
We started the work back east in New York City. And then we were asked to go to Ireland and do a project there. And the Santa Fe Opera heard about it. And in 2005, we had an opportunity to do a pretty big project with the Santa Fe Opera. And it just didn't make sense for us to use a fiscal sponsor. So we started a nonprofit to receive the money and to be the administrative program oversight and stuff like that.
That was how long ago that you started in New York?
20 years. I think we're actually going on 21 this spring.
And it was always called Little Globe. I love that name, by the way.
I'll tell the story very quickly. So when Molly Sturgis and I relocated here in Santa Fe in 2001, we both were hired as program directors at the Center for Contemporary Arts. I was the curator, I ran the performing arts, she ran the education. And we met the marvelous Jason Silverman, who we hired to help us do film programming. And when the first Gulf Wars happened, Jason came to us and said, let's do an event of an artistic response to this. And Molly and I were like, that's great. And so the three of us got together and started talking about it. And like, let's have different perspectives and different disciplines and so forth. And let's sort of articulate this like, yeah, we're in this complicated world, but we're all living in this world together, this little world. And I don't remember who said it, but somebody said, you mean a little globe? And so we named the event Little Globe. This was in 2002. And so then when we decided that we were going to make a nonprofit, again, I don't remember who said it, but somebody pulled to the surface that word, Little Globe. And it's just one of those things, I'm a musician, so I've been in 1,000 bands, some of which have taken decades to find a name that's kind of okay. You're always lucky. It's always a miracle if you find the right name. And Little Globe is the right name.
Let's say I am a teacher or a public librarian or a nonprofit group, and I can see a million ways to apply this and to use the Culture Connects. Do you offer support for classroom teachers or librarians? It sounds like you contract with nonprofit groups. So, how would that work?
Our collaborations tend to be three different kinds of ways, I think, maybe just two, we'll see. We will partner with an organization like Chainbreaker who says, we've got the data, we need the testimonies. So we'll work together and do that. We write grants, therefore, together unless one of the parties already has funding. So in those cases, it's a partnership. Other cases, we have a set of skills and we have expertise on the team for training, and we will contract with entities. The third way is just that we form a relationship and we don't know what the outcome is going to be. And I'd say that third way is the most fulfilling, where we learn about somebody and we develop conversations, and then over time something happens and we find ourselves working together. That's my favorite one, because oftentimes the opportunities come kind of unexpectedly and it's like it's top of mind, we're ready to go, let's apply for this together, there's an opportunity with the city to do this, whatever it is. But that said, we are a nonprofit and our job is to be as responsive as possible to partners and institutions and teachers and residents.
We're trying to build our institutional capacity to be able to respond to entities who can't necessarily contract with us. Or so more and more we want to not only offer the toolkit for free, but be able to then provide tutorials and trainings as well if that is needed within classrooms. And in the past, we've had specific grants that have allowed us to go into schools. And so just kind of piecemealing it together from different sources of funding to try to make it happen. Our goal is to be able to offer it to schools and classrooms and other nonprofit organizations and people who need it the most, and then find the ways to pay for that, whether it's through individual donors who could help sponsor those sorts of things. We're exploring all different kinds of ways to pay for that.
Just remarkable work. Thank you both so much for taking the time to talk with us today.
Yeah, thank you both.
This has been amazing. Thank you.
And if you would like more information about Little Globe, you can visit their website at littleglobe.org. You can also see some examples of their storytelling efforts at vimeo.com/littleglobe. Augmented Humanity is a program of the New Mexico Humanities Council, produced in partnership with KUNM-FM. You can visit us online and find out more about our programs at nmhumanities.org. Our theme music comes courtesy James Whiten, and we've had production assistance from Tristan Klum.